She spent millions building the most extravagant villa in town. But on the night of her big celebration, the rightful owner walked in, showed one piece of paper, and took it all. Cornell Banning didn't expect to see strangers on his land that Tuesday morning. He was driving back from a supply run at Home Depot, coffee still warm in the cup holder, when he spotted 3 men in neon vests hammering stakes into the soil his grandfather had once plowed with his own hands. The lot wasn't much to look at, an acre of dry Texas earth, fenced with rusting wire, a patch of mesquite trees shading the far corner. But to Cornell, it was family ground. He slowed his truck and pulled over on the gravel shoulder, staring. A white pickup with a contractor's logo sat near the property line, tailgate down, rolls of blueprints spread across it. A woman in a tailored beige blazer stood beside the men, pointing, nodding, giving orders like she owned the place. Cornell stepped out of his truck, boots crunching against gravel, and called out, "Excuse me! What do you think you're doing?" The woman didn't flinch. She turned, chin tilted high, dark sunglasses masking her eyes. "Surveying," she said flatly, like he should have known. "This is my land." Cornell replied, his voice low but sharp. "Banning property. Has been for 3 generations." One of the workers glanced at the woman, uncomfortable. She didn't waver. "It's unused," she said, dismissing him with a flick of her hand. "We're assessing it for community development. A project that will raise everyone's property values." Cornell's jaw clenched. "You didn't ask me." "Nobody asked me." The men shifted uneasily, but the woman didn't blink. She walked closer, clicking across the dirt in heels that had no business out here. "Mr. Banning, is it?" "I'm Judith Marrow, president of the Willow Bend HOA." Her voice carried the same tone a teacher might use on a child. "This is about progress, about lifting this neighborhood into what it was always meant to be. You'll see." Cornell stared at her, trying to steady the anger rising in his chest. "You don't touch a man's land without his say. You don't erase history for your own vision." Judith smiled, but it was thin and sharp. "History doesn't pay the bills, and frankly, your acre is an eyesore. We're correcting that." One of the workers coughed, avoiding Cornell's gaze. Another started re-rolling the blueprints, as if he wanted no part of the confrontation. But Judith lifted her chin higher, radiating confidence. Cornell's voice dropped. "My grandfather used to say, 'The land remembers who walks it.' You're not walking it with respect." For the first time, Judith's smile faltered, just slightly. Then she waved him off like a nuisance. "Lawyers can argue later. Right now, we build." Cornell didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply turned back to his truck, sat behind the wheel, and gripped the steering wheel tight enough that his knuckles whitened. He could have called the police right then, could have driven straight to the courthouse and filed an injunction. But something in him said, "Wait. Watch. Let her think she's in control." He watched her gesture broadly to the men, watched them hammer more stakes, watched the boundaries of his family's land get swallowed by arrogance. The sight cut deep, but it also lit a strange spark inside him. She thought she'd won already. She thought her title and her blazer and her confidence would erase his name from the deed. Cornell started his truck, the engine rumbling beneath him. He took one last look at the acre, his acre, and at Judith Marrow standing there like a queen giving orders. He drove off without another word, but a plan had already begun to take root in his mind. He wouldn't stop her, not yet. But if she wanted to pour millions into a palace on his soil, he'd let her dig the hole deeper first. Long before surveyors showed up with tape measures and neon vests, the acre in Plano carried weight in Cornell Banning's family. His grandfather, Elijah Banning, had bought it in the late 1940s after returning from the war. It wasn't prime real estate back then, just a stretch of dusty soil at the edge of a modest farming community. But to Elijah, it represented permanence. A place where no landlord could knock on the door and say, "Time's up." Cornell grew up walking those lines of wire fence with his grandfather, who taught him how to fix sagging posts with little more than grit and baling wire. Elijah would say, "Boy, dirt's the one thing they ain't making more of. You guard it. You honor it." Those words stayed lodged in Cornell's mind, even after he grew up, left for college in Oklahoma, and built a career in logistics that kept him traveling across states more than he stayed home. When Elijah passed, the land went to Cornell's father, and when his father died, it came to Cornell. By then, Plano had changed. New homes sprouted where cornfields once stood, and developers eyed every patch of unused earth like wolves scenting prey. But Cornell never sold. Not because the lot was making him rich. In truth, it sat empty, barely paying its property tax bills each year. But because it was his grandfather's fingerprint on the world. He'd park his truck there sometimes after long days, shut off the engine, and just sit in the quiet. He'd remember Elijah's calloused hands, the smell of tobacco on his shirt, the steady voice that told him a man's dignity was tied to what he protected. To outsiders, it looked like neglected land. To Cornell, it was a ledger of his family's endurance. The neighborhood around it grew more polished as years passed. Fences turned into stone walls, yards manicured into glossy perfection. The HOA came into power, declaring rules about mailbox colors, lawn heights, even what curtains could show from the street. Cornell never joined. His land wasn't part of their tract housing. He stayed separate, on his own ground, uninterested in their newsletters and their so-called community pride. But that separation was exactly what made his acre stand out. To HOA eyes, it looked like a blemish. To Judith Marrow, it looked like an opportunity. Cornell didn't know much about her then, not beyond the whispers neighbors shared. They said Judith had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, pushing residents to repaint homes, install matching shutters, and replace flower beds that didn't fit her vision. She wasn't just president, she was the face of the neighborhood, the kind of person who believed every street sign and garden hedge reflected her. That's why, when Cornell saw her that first day on his property, clipboard in hand, he understood exactly what was happening. She wasn't just trying to build something, she was trying to erase his family's history and write her own name over it. That night, Cornell drove to his mother's old house and pulled out the deed papers he kept in a fireproof box. He traced his finger over his grandfather's signature, bold and steady, and felt a wave of anger surge in his chest. But behind the anger came clarity. He had the law on his side. He didn't need to shout or throw fists, he just needed patience. The land had taught him that. Patience. You don't harvest the same day you plant. You wait. You let things grow. And sometimes you let your opponent think they're ahead, because the fall will be harder when truth hits. Still, it hurt. Every childhood memory he had of running through tall grass with cousins, every story his father told him about Elijah buying the acre with cash he'd saved from factory shifts, all of it felt under siege now. Someone was treating it like an empty canvas, when for him it was a full book already written. Cornell sat at his kitchen table late into the night, coffee cooling by his hand, the papers spread out before him. He wasn't just defending dirt, he was defending legacy. But legacy alone wouldn't stop bulldozers, and soon, he realized, the fight would get louder, dirtier, and far more public. Judith Marrow wasn't the kind of woman who settled for second place. At 49, she had carved out a reputation in Plano's Willow Bend community as someone who could turn cracked driveways and sagging roofs into picture-perfect brochures for real estate agents. She wore it like armor, crisp blazers, pearl studs, manicured nails, the image of control. To her, the HOA wasn't just a volunteer role, it was a throne. Neighbors whispered about her relentlessness. If your grass grew too long, Judith sent a letter. If your shutters didn't match the approved color palette, you'd hear about it. If your Christmas lights lingered past January 5th, she'd threaten fines. To some, she was exhausting. To others, she was a force of order, the reason property values kept climbing. Judith preferred the latter description, but one piece of land irritated her every time she drove past it, that lone acre owned by Cornell Banning. She called it the sore thumb of Willow Bend. The grass grew wild, fences leaned, and no house stood there to match the neighborhood's tidy rhythm. To Judith, it wasn't heritage. It was wasted space. She'd spoken about it during HOA meetings. Imagine, she said once, pacing in front of a room of homeowners seated in folding chairs. That lot could hold the crown jewel of our neighborhood, a landmark property, something that elevates all of us. Her voice carried conviction, and though a few residents shifted uneasily, no one wanted to challenge her. Judith had a way of turning disagreement into social excel. Behind closed doors, she nurtured the idea like a seed. She hired an architect from Dallas to draft concepts. She toured homes in Highland Park, scribbling notes about imported tiles and archways. When she saw photos of a villa in Scottsdale with sweeping verandas and a reflecting pool, she clipped them into a folder labeled Marrow Project. She envisioned more than a house. She imagined a symbol, a Mediterranean-style villa worth $6 million, sitting like a monument in the middle of Plano, with her name whispered every time neighbors pointed to it. In her mind, the HOA presidency wasn't enough anymore. She wanted a legacy carved in stone and marble. Judith justified her plan with economics. A home that grand would raise the bar. She argued it would attract wealthier families, push property values up, and make the whole neighborhood more desirable. She told herself she was doing everyone a favor, though at the core, it was vanity. She wanted something that said, Judith built this. Her allies, a circle of neighbors who both feared and admired her, fed her confidence. At a wine and cheese gathering in her backyard, she held court. Cornell doesn't even use that land, she said, swirling a glass of Chardonnay. It's just sitting there. Overgrown. Wasted. He should be thanking me for improving it. A neighbor, a thin man named Gerald, mumbled, But he owns it, doesn't he? Judith flashed her sharp smile. Ownership is just paper. Progress is reality. By the time the villa is finished, who's going to care whose name is on some dusty deed? The group chuckled nervously. They weren't sure if she was joking. Judith didn't clarify. Meanwhile, she courted investors quietly. She promised them visibility, prestige, and bragging rights. This isn't just a house, she told one Dallas developer over lunch. It's a showcase. Everyone who drives through Willow Bend will see it and know quality lives here. The developer raised an eyebrow. And the owner of the land? Judith waved her hand as though brushing crumbs off a table. Handled. It's a formality. Trust me, once construction begins, there won't be any turning back. Her confidence was her weapon. She moved with the certainty of someone who believed rules bent for her. And with each conversation, with every sketch she approved, the vision grew sharper in her mind. Arched verandas catching the Texas sun, polished stone imported from Italy, a reflecting pool mirroring the sky. She could practically hear the compliments already. But not everyone was convinced. At a neighborhood block party, Cornell overheard fragments of conversation. Someone mentioned Judith's big project, like it was already a done deal. He kept it. The sound hit Cornell before the sight did. The deep, rhythmic thud of machinery pounding into the earth. He turned onto the street and felt his stomach tighten. There it was. A backhoe cutting into the soil his grandfather once walked, the acre fenced off with temporary orange barriers, and workers in hard hats moving with a sense of urgency. Cornell parked his truck across the street and sat for a moment, watching. Concrete trucks idled in line. Rebar glistened in the morning light. It was no longer just survey stakes. This was construction in full swing. He climbed out and walked straight across the road. A foreman noticed him and lifted a hand. Sir, you can't be inside the barrier. Cornell ignored the warning. Who gave you permission to build here? His voice carried above the noise, sharp and direct. The foreman hesitated. Talk to Miss Marrow. She's handling all approvals. Cornell didn't have to wait long. Judith arrived in her SUV, stepping out in slacks and heels as if she were arriving at a gala rather than a construction site. Her sunglasses reflected the chaos behind her. She smiled like the mess of machinery belonged to her. Cornell, she said smoothly. Good morning. What the hell do you think you're doing? He shot back, his voice low but shaking with anger. This is my family's property. You can't just... Judith raised a hand, silencing him like a teacher correcting a child. I've already explained this. This project benefits everyone. Look at the jobs, the investment. Do you want to hold back progress because you're sentimental about weeds and wire fencing? Cornell's fists curled at his sides. You're trespassing. This isn't just weeds. This is banning land. You don't erase history because it doesn't fit your brochure. A few workers slowed their pace, pretending to check blueprints but really listening in. The tension hung heavy in the air. Judith leaned in slightly, her perfume cutting through the dust. Then sue me, she said quietly. But by the time the courts drag their feet, this villa will be finished. And once people see it, nobody will care who filed what paperwork. Cornell stared at her, fury in his eyes. But he didn't shout. You're building a castle on quicksand, Judith, she smirked. Funny, it looks like solid ground to me. The foreman cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to move the conversation along. Ms. Marrow, we need your approval on the foundation lines. Judith turned away without another word, her heels clicking against the gravel. She didn't look back. Cornell walked back to his truck, each step heavier than the last. Neighbors had begun gathering along the sidewalk, whispering. A woman with a stroller glanced at him with sympathy, while an older man shook his head as if to say, Don't fight her. You won't win. Later that evening, Cornell stood at the edge of the lot again. The forms for the foundation were already in place, wooden frames outlining where walls would soon rise. He could see the shape taking form, and the weight of what Judith was attempting pressed hard on him. His phone buzzed with a call from his cousin, Jerome, who lived a few miles away. You seeing this? Jerome asked. I'm looking at it right now, Cornell said. That woman's crazy. You gonna stop her? Cornell's eyes followed the outline of the future villa, the workers laughing near the concrete mixer. Not yet, he said slowly. What do you mean, not yet? She's stealing your land, man. Cornell's grip tightened around the phone. Sometimes the best way to beat someone is to let them think they've won. Let her pour her pride and her money into this. Every brick she lays just makes my case stronger. There was silence on the line. Then Jerome sighed. You sure about this? Cornell nodded to himself. I've never been surer. The following days proved difficult. Each time he drove past, the villa grew. Walls rose, steel beams went in, and trucks arrived with stacks of stone. Neighbors started talking openly, their voices carrying down the street. I heard it's going to be worth $6 million. Can you imagine the parties? Finally, someone's improving that land. Cornell clenched his jaw when he overheard it, but he stayed silent. He wasn't interested in rumors. He was watching, waiting, documenting. Every invoice, every shipment, every square foot laid down without his consent. Judith paraded through the site daily, shaking hands with investors, praising workers, and smiling like a queen watching her palace rise. To her, Cornell was just background noise. To him, she was writing the first act of her own downfall. But with every beam that went up, the stakes grew higher, and soon silence alone wouldn't be enough to hold back the storm. Cornell could have stormed into a lawyer's office that very week and filed a restraining order. He could have called the county, raised hell, demanded inspections, forced fines. But instead, he did the one thing Judith Marrow didn't expect. Nothing. At least nothing that showed on the surface. Behind closed doors, Cornell was working. He pulled the deed from his fireproof box, scanned it into digital copies, and sent them to his attorney, a steady old friend named Paul Richter out of Dallas. Paul read the papers twice and said over the phone, Cornell, this is airtight. Your name is on it. Your grandfather's signature before that. You've got a chain of ownership clear as daylight. Cornell leaned back in his chair, listening to the clatter of construction echo faintly, even through his windows. So if I take her to court... You'll win, Paul interrupted. But it could drag on for months, maybe years if she fights. You'll get the land back, sure, but if the house is finished by then... That gets complicated. Cornell rubbed his temples. Complicated how? Well, technically the structure belongs to the landowner once it's built on your property. That'd be you. But she'll scream fraud, appeal, maybe even counter-sue for damages. It'll be a mess. Costly too. Cornell stayed silent for a long moment. Then I wait, he said finally. Wait? Paul repeated, surprised. Let her hang herself. Every dollar she spends, every brick she lays. When the dust settles, it's mine. All of it, Paul whistled low. That's cold-blooded, Cornell. It's patient. Cornell corrected. And so, he waited. Every morning he drove past the site, sometimes slowing his truck just enough to see the progress. Workers poured concrete, laid rebar, set scaffolding. He took photos from the road, time-stamped them, saved them into folders. Neighbors thought he was powerless, but in truth, he was building a record as steady as the foundation going into the dirt. The hardest part was keeping his anger in check. On more than one occasion, he felt the urge to march onto the lot and shut everything down himself. But he remembered his grandfather's words. "Land teaches patience, boy." You can't rush the harvest. One evening, he stopped at a gas station and overheard two construction workers grabbing sodas inside. "Man, this place is something else," one said. "Imported stone, custom everything. Heard it's going to be worth 6, maybe 7 million." The other chuckled. "Can you believe the HOA president just grabbed the land like that? Bold, man. Real bold." Cornell pretended not to listen, paid for his coffee, and walked out. His truck door slammed harder than he intended. The workers thought it was bold. He thought it was theft. Still, he said nothing. Judith, meanwhile, grew louder. She hosted walkthroughs for donors even when the place was only beams and scaffolding. She stood on plywood floors in high heels, gesturing with manicured hands at unfinished walls. "Here's the grand hall," she told a small group one Saturday, her voice echoing against exposed studs. "Double staircase, custom railings flown in from Italy. Picture it." "This will redefine Plano A," woman in the group gasped. "It's incredible, Judith." "Absolutely incredible," Judith beamed. "It's not just for me. It's for all of us. Property values will rise across the board. You'll thank me when you sell." Cornell, standing just beyond the temporary fence, caught her eye. For the briefest moment, her smile faltered, but she quickly turned back to her audience. He tipped his hat in her direction, calm, steady, as if to say, "I see you. Keep going," and she did. As weeks turned into months, the villa climbed higher. Roof tiles gleamed in the Texas sun, the reflecting pool began to take shape, and chandeliers arrived in crates marked "fragile" from overseas. Judith walked the site like a monarch inspecting her palace. Cornell stayed in the shadows, watching, waiting, collecting evidence. Neighbors began whispering that maybe he had given up. Some thought he'd sold the land quietly, that Judith had bought him out. Others said he didn't have the fight in him. They were wrong. Cornell wasn't surrendering. He was sharpening his blade. Every day Judith spent flaunting her power. She was building not just a house, but her own downfall, brick by brick. But even patience has limits, and as the villa neared completion, the tension between them was about to boil over in public. By late spring, the acre barely resembled the patch of dirt Cornell had grown up knowing. Where his grandfather once walked with a shovel slung over his shoulder, marble tiles now glistened in the sun. Trucks pulled in daily, delivering Italian stone, custom woodwork from Oregon, and crates so large they had to be lifted with cranes. The house was no longer a skeleton of beams. It had a face now, a looming Mediterranean villa that towered over the neighborhood. Cornell drove past in his truck every morning, sometimes slowing enough to watch workers lay stone or fit glass into arched windows. He took photos discreetly, time-stamped them, and saved them into his growing archive. To anyone else, he looked like a man defeated, standing on the outside of a dream he couldn't stop. But Cornell knew the truth. This was evidence. Every dollar Judith spent, every imported chandelier she hung, was a nail in her own coffin. Neighbors started to talk openly now. Judith hosted casual gatherings on the site, offering wine and hors d'oeuvres even before walls were finished. She walked guests through unfinished hallways, pointing to where a gallery wall would hang or where the grand staircase would curve. 6 million minimum, she told them with confidence. This is going to be the crown jewel of Plano. Everyone benefits. You'll see your home values jump overnight. Cornell stood across the street one Saturday when she was mid-tour. He leaned against his truck, arms folded, listening to the chatter of neighbors gasping at imported fixtures and French doors. A woman's voice carried across the lot. "Judith, this is stunning." "Absolutely stunning." Judith's heels clicked against the marble as she replied, "It's vision, Barbara. Some people can't see it, but I can." Her eyes flicked toward Cornell then, just for a moment. She didn't speak his name, but her smirk carried enough message. "You've already lost." That night, Cornell met his cousin Jerome for dinner at a barbecue joint off US 75. Over brisket and iced tea, Jerome shook his head. "Man, I don't know how you stand it. I'd have chained myself to a bulldozer by now." Cornell sliced into his brisket slowly. "Let her build." Jerome frowned. "She's showing off like it's hers." Cornell set his fork down. "That's the thing, Jerome. It isn't. Every imported brick, every square foot of polished stone, it's being planted in my soil. She doesn't see it, but she's decorating my house for me." Jerome leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "Cold. Real cold." "Fair," Cornell corrected. "My grandfather didn't break his back, so someone could erase our name from this land. If she wants to play queen, fine. But the crown sits on my dirt. Meanwhile, Judith's ambitions only grew bolder. She arranged for a Dallas magazine to feature the villa as a neighborhood transformation project, giving an interview on camera where she declared, "This is about setting a standard. Plano deserves elegance. This property will symbolize progress." The reporter asked about ownership, and Judith chuckled dismissively. "Technicalities. What matters is vision." Cornell watched that interview from his living room, remote in hand, shaking his head. The arrogance almost amused him now. Almost. Each day the villa crept closer to completion. The reflecting pool was tiled in shades of sapphire blue. Imported columns stood like soldiers at the entrance. Inside, workers installed chandeliers the size of small cars. Judith walked through daily, inspecting, instructing, already imagining her first gala. But what she didn't know was that Cornell was keeping every scrap of proof. Receipts pulled from discarded boxes, photos of license plates from subcontractors, notarized notes from neighbors who had overheard her claims. He wasn't idle. He was patient. The neighborhood split into camps. Some admired Judith, calling her bold, visionary, unstoppable. Others muttered that she'd crossed a line, but none said it loud enough to matter. Cornell became a ghost in his own story, silent, watchful, enduring. Yet under that silence, a storm brewed. Each brick added weight to the inevitable moment. The villa was nearly finished now. Landscaping crews rolled in, planting olive trees and manicured hedges. Trucks hauled away debris. The project that began with survey stakes now stood as... By midsummer, the villa was nearly complete. The roof tiles shone like copper under the Texas sun, and the grand arched entrance stood finished, waiting for a door that had been custom-ordered from Spain. Judith's dream was standing in stone now, and she carried herself like the neighborhood had already crowned her queen. But Cornell was reaching his breaking point. He drove past one Friday afternoon to see workers planting palm trees along the driveway. The sight tightened his chest. Palms in Plano, of all places. Judith wanted the house to scream wealth, even if it meant ignoring Texas heat and soil. He parked across the street, hands gripping the steering wheel, when Judith spotted him. She strode across the lot, heels clicking on the paved driveway, a glass of sparkling water in hand as though she were already hosting. "Well, if it isn't the silent observer," she said smoothly. "I was beginning to think you'd given up." Cornell opened his door and stepped out slowly. "Given up on my land?" Never. Judith tilted her head, smirk playing at her lips. "You keep saying that, and yet here we are. Almost done. $6 million of progress standing right here while you take pictures from your truck." Cornell's voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "You can lay down gold on this soil, Judith, but the deed's still in my name." She laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Paperwork. Do you know how many loopholes there are in this state? Lawyers can argue for years. By the time anyone settles, I'll have lived in this house long enough to call it mine." Cornell stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think money gives you ownership. You think arrogance makes you untouchable. But let me tell you something my grandfather taught me. Land doesn't forget its owner, and this land doesn't belong to you." The workers nearby paused their shovels, eyes darting between the two. Judith's smile stiffened. but she wouldn't back down. "Then stop me," she said. "Go ahead. Call your lawyer. File your papers. I dare you." Cornell looked her dead in the eye. "Not yet." The words rattled her more than shouting would have. She stepped back, visibly annoyed. "You enjoy your little fantasy, Cornell. Because soon the entire neighborhood will see what progress looks like. And you'll just be the man who couldn't keep up." Cornell didn't reply. He turned and walked back to his truck, his silence sharper than any insult. That night, word spread fast. Neighbors whispered about the confrontation, some siding with Judith, others quietly rooting for Cornell. At a backyard barbecue down the street, Gerald, the thin man who once questioned Judith's plans, leaned over to his wife and muttered, "I don't think Banning's beaten. He's too calm, too sure." Meanwhile, Judith doubled down. She hosted an early preview event in the half-finished villa, inviting local business leaders, a city council member, and even a lifestyle blogger from Dallas. She greeted them in the grand foyer, unfinished walls hidden behind draped fabric, champagne glasses passed out by hired servers. "Picture it," she said, gesturing broadly. "A landmark property. This villa will redefine Plano, raise our profile, bring in the kind of residents we deserve." A council member nodded politely, but the blogger pressed. "And the land?" "I've heard some talk." Judith's smile didn't crack. "A minor technical dispute. Nothing more. Once the villa's complete, the matter will be resolved in my favor." "It always is." Cornell watched from the sidewalk, arms crossed, as the glow of chandelier light spilled through the windows. Guests clinked glasses, laughter echoing into the night. To them, Judith was a visionary. To him, she was digging her own grave with every toast. Inside, one of the workers quietly approached Judith. "Ma'am, Mr. Banning's outside again." Judith waved him off. "Let him watch. That's all he can do." Cornell stayed until the last guest left, headlights disappearing one by one. He stared at the villa, tall and gleaming against the night sky. Then he whispered to himself, "Steady and certain. You've had your moment, Judith. The next one's mine." But Judith didn't realize that her moment of triumph was about to become the stage for Cornell's reveal. And the fall would be public, brutal. The night of Judith's grand unveiling arrived like a staged performance. The villa gleamed under floodlights, every corner polished as if it had been built for royalty. A red carpet stretched across the driveway, leading into the double-arched entrance where servers in white shirts balanced trays of champagne. Cars lined the street, luxury SUVs and sedans parked nose to tail, their headlights catching the pale stone of the mansion. Cornell sat in his truck at the far end of the block, hands resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't dressed for the occasion, just jeans, boots, and a button-down shirt. But he wasn't there to blend in. Tonight wasn't about appearances. Tonight was about truth. Guests arrived in clusters, their voices carrying across the street. "Look at this place. Judith really outdid herself. This is going to change the whole neighborhood." Each compliment was another stone on the pile of arrogance Judith had stacked high. Inside, Judith floated from room to room in a silver dress, her hair swept back, her voice brimming with pride. "Here's the ballroom," she told one group, her hand grazing a marble column. Imported chandeliers, Venetian mirrors, hand-carved moldings. Only the best. She raised a glass of champagne. To progress. To vision. To Willow Bend's future. The guests clapped, glasses clinking. But just beyond the gate, Cornell pushed his door open and stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel. He walked slowly up the driveway, past the red carpet, and into the glow of the entryway. Heads turned, conversations hushed. Judith spotted him from across the foyer. Her smile faltered, but only for a breath. Then she smoothed it over, voice carrying through the hall. "Well, look who decided to join us. Mr. Banning, welcome. Come to finally see progress up close?" Cornell's eyes swept the room, taking in the chandeliers, the polished marble, the crowd of neighbors and donors sipping champagne. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document, thick with age and stamped with county seals. "I didn't come to see progress," he said. His voice was calm but strong, cutting through the silence. "I came to remind you who this land belongs to." He unfolded the deed slowly, the paper creasing under his hands, and held it up for all to see. Elijah Banning purchased this acre in 1947, passed it to his son, and now it sits in my name. Legally, rightfully, every brick, every tile, every chandelier in this house stands on my soil, which makes it mine. The crowd gasped, murmurs spreading like wildfire. A woman covered her mouth. A man whispered, "He owns it?" Judith's face stiffened, but she forced a laugh, waving a hand dismissively. "This is a stunt. A pathetic stunt. You can wave old papers around all night, Cornell, but this house is mine. Everyone here knows it." Cornell stepped closer, his boots echoing on the marble floor. "You can argue in front of your guests, Judith, but the county clerk's office won't call it a stunt. The title's in my name. The deed's on record. Every dollar you poured into this place, every favor you called in, all of it landed in my pocket the moment you laid a foundation." Gasps turned to whispers. Phones came out, neighbors snapping pictures, recording video. A Dallas business leader in the crowd muttered to his wife, "If that's true, she's ruined." Judith's mask began to crack. Her voice trembled just slightly. "You think you can walk in here, in front of my guests, and humiliate me?" Cornell didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You did that yourself the moment you decided my history was disposable." Silence fell heavy. Judith's face flushed crimson, her hand tightening around her glass until it cracked with a faint snap. Shards glittered against the marble. Cornell folded the deed back into his pocket and turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he looked back at the stunned crowd. "Remember this night." Not as the celebration of a mansion, but as the lesson of what happens when pride outruns respect. He left quietly, while inside, the gala crumbled. Guests whispered excuses, slipping out with hurried goodbyes. Investors looked at Judith with narrowed eyes. And Judith, standing in the glow of the chandeliers she had fought so hard to hang, realized she had built her triumph on someone else's foundation, and lost it all in a single stroke. But humiliation was only the beginning. Soon, the fallout would stretch beyond the neighborhood, reaching newsrooms, courtrooms, and the entire city's attention. By the following morning, the neighborhood was in an uproar. What had started as whispered speculation the night before had erupted into full-blown gossip over morning coffee, group texts, and social media feeds. Videos from the gala spread like wildfire. Cornell standing calm in the marble foyer, deed in hand, declaring ownership. Judith's face pale with shock. The champagne glass breaking in her hand. Local news stations picked it up almost immediately. The Plano Chronicle ran a headline online. HOA president builds $6 million mansion on land she doesn't own. By noon, Dallas stations were circling the story, sending camera crews into the neighborhood. Anchors called it a modern cautionary tale about arrogance, entitlement, and property law. Cornell hadn't planned for any of this fanfare. He woke up to his phone buzzing non-stop, reporters leaving messages, neighbors calling, even distant relatives he hadn't spoken to in years checking in. He ignored most of it. He wasn't chasing attention. He was defending his family's name. Judith, on the other hand, went silent. The woman who once thrived on being seen everywhere suddenly drew her curtains and avoided neighbors. But silence didn't stop the storm. Investors who had backed her project demanded explanations. Contractors who hadn't been paid in full stopped showing up. A Dallas magazine quietly pulled her feature story, replacing it with an editor's note citing legal complications. By the end of the week, Judith's empire was cracking. A group of neighbors gathered at Gerald's house one evening, sitting on folding chairs in his garage. The tone was hushed but firm. "Did you see the Chronicle piece?" one woman asked. "They called it the biggest HOA blunder in years." Gerald rubbed his chin. "She's finished. No way she keeps her position after this. She's embarrassed all of us." A man in the back shook his head. "She embarrassed herself." Cornell warned her, and she ignored him. "That's on her." They nodded in agreement. For the first time in years, Judith no longer inspired fear. She inspired pity, and for some, satisfaction. Meanwhile, Cornell kept his composure. At a diner in McKinney, A young reporter slid into the booth across from him. "Mr. Banning," she said, voice eager, "what does it feel like to own a $6 million house you didn't spend a dime building?" Cornell sipped his coffee, letting the question hang. Finally he answered, "It feels heavy, because it's not about the house. It's about respect. My grandfather worked hard for that acre." She tried to erase him. "I couldn't let that stand," the reporter scribbled furiously. "And what do you plan to do with the property?" Cornell gave a small shrug. "Haven't decided yet, but one thing's certain. It's mine. Always has been." Back in Willow Bend, Judith faced consequences she couldn't spin away. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Residents who once sat quietly through her lectures now lined up to speak against her. "You abused your power," one woman said, her voice steady. "You treated our neighborhood like your personal stage." Judith sat rigid at the head of the table, jaw tight, lips pressed thin. When it came time to vote, the decision was unanimous. She was removed as HOA president effective immediately. The news hit her harder than she expected. For years, she had defined herself by control, by the way people looked at her when she spoke. Now, stripped of her title and exposed for her arrogance, she was left with nothing but an unfinished dream and a house she could never claim. Cornell heard about her removal through the grapevine. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he drove out to the property late one evening. The villa stood dark and empty, its marble columns casting long shadows under the moonlight. He walked the perimeter slowly, his boots crunching against gravel, the same land he'd once paced as a boy with his grandfather. The sight filled him with complicated emotions. Triumph, yes, but also sadness. So much money, effort, and pride wasted because one person refused to respect a simple truth. Land isn't just dirt. It's memory. It's legacy. It's law. Standing there, he whispered softly, "Granddad, we kept it." She tried, but we kept it. But while the neighborhood was settling into its new reality, the larger world wasn't done with the story yet. Soon lawyers, courts, and even strangers far beyond Plano would weigh in on what had happened. In the weeks after Judith's downfall, the story took on a life of its own. Local news gave way to state coverage, and before long, national outlets ran features with headlines that bordered on sensational. "Man lets HOA president build dream mansion, then claims it as his own." Comment sections filled with fiery debates. Some called Cornell a genius for playing the long game. Others accused him of cruelty, saying he should have stopped Judith before she sank millions into the villa. Cornell didn't answer those voices. He stayed grounded, just as his grandfather had taught him. What mattered wasn't the noise outside. It was the principle. His family had been written out of too many things before, and he wasn't about to let their land be stolen under the guise of progress. Judith, meanwhile, all but vanished. Once the face of Willow Bend, she was now a ghost in her own neighborhood. Curtains drawn, driveway empty, her name spoken only in hushed tones. Rumor had it she was facing lawsuits from investors, angry contractors, even the city itself for misleading officials. For someone who had built her life on control, the collapse was absolute. Cornell didn't revel in her pain. In fact, he told Jerome one evening over barbecue, "I never wanted her destroyed. I wanted respect for my family. That's it." Jerome leaned back, arms crossed. "Respect's a hard thing to teach, cuz. Some folks don't learn until they lose." Cornell nodded slowly. "That's the lesson, isn't it? Pride without respect is just a cliff waiting to crumble." He thought often about what to do with the villa. Neighbors speculated endlessly. Some hoped he'd move in, others thought he might sell it off and walk away with millions. But Cornell wasn't quick to decide. To him, this wasn't just about money or luxury. It was about honoring the soil beneath the marble. One Sunday, he walked the property again, the house quiet in the afternoon sun. He paused by the reflecting pool, its water still and glassy, and remembered his grandfather's words. "Dirt's the one thing they ain't making more of. You guard it. You honor it." Cornell realized the true inheritance wasn't the house Judith had built. It was the lesson she had given everyone else. A reminder that arrogance blinds, that power unchecked always backfires, and that patience, though painful, can be the sharpest weapon. When a reporter caught up with him weeks later, Cornell put it plainly. This was never about revenge. It was about respect. My grandfather earned this land with his sweat. My father carried it on. I wasn't about to let pride erase it. That villa is just proof that no matter how much money or influence you think you have, the ground will always belong to the one whose name is on the deed. The reporter asked if he felt sorry for Judith. Cornell paused, then answered, I feel sorry she couldn't see past herself. If she had come to me first, if she'd respected the history here, maybe we could have built something together. But she chose arrogance, and arrogance doesn't last. The story slowly left the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new news cycles. But in Plano, the memory lingered. Neighbors told the tale to newcomers as a cautionary parable. Don't underestimate patience, and don't confuse power with ownership. Cornell went on with his life, quieter than before, but surer of one thing. He had honored his grandfather's words. The land had stayed in the family. It had outlasted arrogance. It had outlasted vanity. And it always would. In the end, the $6 million villa stood less as a symbol of Judith's vision and more as a monument to her downfall. And to Cornell, it stood as proof that respect, patience, and legacy matter more than any marble column or chandelier. Because pride fades, houses crumble, but land, and the respect you show it, endures. And if there's one lesson this story should leave you with, it's this. Never underestimate the value of patience, never let arrogance strip away your dignity, and never forget the power of legacy. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more.